New Spain. The Aztec lands run red with blood, the blood now runs in streams. The priest, he cuts another heart, oh hear the victim screams. 10,000 men, 10,000 more, 10,000 children die. The wrath of hell now preys on men, and no one hears their cry. They raid the other villages, and choosing from their best, they kill them all in sacrifice, at Satan's own request. An altar stone with incense lit upon a temple stands. The priest of death now wields a knife and tears apart a man. As far as I can see this day, the world has gone to hell. Now all creation cries as one, and nature tolls her bell. There lives a tale in Aztec lore, behold the prophecy. A better God is said to come from o'er the eastern sea. Then 20 score and 5 men come, their plight is vastly dire. No man at all does flee this fight, but to their ships set fire. Then 20 score and 5 men come, they bring the word of God, the light to dark, the health to sick, where he has yet not trod. A Spanish crew, a Catholic crew, a blessed crew to see. The prophecy it is fulfilled, a greater God is he. The sides are set, the battle old, itself as old as time, when Satan in his pride commits that first premortal crime. They break the shrines and kill their priests, they kill the men of death. And now a nation is in need of a new breath. A new beginning starts again, the Spaniards start to build, but something more is needed yet, 100-fold to yield. A land possessed needs tenderness, a mother's love to know, that fount of life to fructify and make new life to grow. To Juan Diego she appears as he goes walking home, to ask the bishop now to make a shrine to which men come. The doubting Thomas asks for signs, O little faith of man, you can't defray a mother's love, a love that nothing can. An image fair, so fair beheld, she speaks as does a star. With gentleness and beauty pure, she sends her life afar. She bears the sun, she's clothed with stars, upon the moon she stands. A virgin mother bearing child, she nourishes the lands.
Very appropriate for today's feast day, and sets the scene because we're obviously going to be continuing our talk about the history of Christendom, and Maria Guadalupe, of course, is Queen of Christendom, which, of course, that's one of her manifestations. So this is the third of 8 lectures. Thanks again for coming. It seems that most of you are returning, so you either sucker for punishment or very wise, I'm not sure which. And for those handful, those of you that's happy to be here for the first time, I hope you enjoy it and come back for the 4th, and so on till we finish. So we're going to cover the whole history of Christendom, and we're now in the 3rd, and we're going to be covering the 5th to the 10th centuries. And the general or generic title I've given to this lecture is The Death and Resurrection of Rome. So we're going to begin in the 5th century, and it is the century, of course, of the fall of the Roman Empire. But at the beginning of the century, there's no way that anybody could have predicted what that century would bring. It's something we should all perhaps bear in mind. I remember being British, not old enough to remember the exact timing, but 1897 was the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And at that time, the British Empire ruled the world, ruled the waves, and I think it was something like 25%, 30% of the land area of the world was under the dominion of the British Empire, 1897. By 1917, really, the end of World War II, World War I, 20 years later, it was in ruins. So history has this way of being a tapestry of repetitions, which is the whole point of the good, the bad, and the beautiful, this tapestry. So the 5th century, so again, the other thing, by the way, the tapestry, every century, we're going to be looking at it in terms of the good, the bad, and the beautiful. So that's the pattern we've had in the previous 2 lectures. So we begin always with the good, appropriately. So again, in the 5th century, the good. The 5th century, one of the most chaotic and cataclysmic in terms of political conflict, would be a time in which the church would rise from the ashes of empire. In 400, the Roman Empire held dominion over most of Europe, the north of Africa, and swathes of Asia. By 500, it lay in ruins. The world is passing away, wrote St. Augustine. The world is old. The world is succumbing. The world's already panting with decay. But do not be afraid. Your youth will be renewed. And I'm not going to give running commentaries about how this is all very familiar to the 21st century. I'm hoping you're going to get those connections. And of course, in the 5th century, we have one of the great masterpieces of Western civilization that's written. I wrote something this past week, the 7 Pillars of Western Civilization, and this is one of them, The City of God, by St. Augustine. And again, this sets the motif, the pattern, that in every single generation, as in every single human heart, is the battle between Homo Viator, pilgrim man, man on the quest, and Homo Superbus, the man who refuses the quest. We either serve ultimately the city of God, or we serve the city of man. And the other thing St. Augustine did in that masterful work was to fuse together in indissoluble union fides et ratio, faith and reason. He brought, for instance, Greek philosophy into the conversation. He brought Plato into the conversation. He showed the limitations of Plato, but also the fact that the good things in Plato, and showed that Christendom ultimately was the marriage of faith and reason. So here's a quote from the City of God. For some remain constant in the good that is common to all, which for them is God himself, and in his eternity, truth and love. Others, however, took delight in their own power, as if they were themselves their own good, and these fell away from the higher good that is common to all, the good which makes blessed, and turned instead to private ends of their own. They exchanged the heights of eternity for the self-exaltation of pride, the certainty of truth for the cunning of folly, and the oneness of love for the zeal of partisanship. And so they became arrogant, deceitful, and invidious. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Another major council of the church in this 5th century was the Council of Ephesus in 431, which amongst other things gave to the Mother of God the title of the Mother of God, the Theotokos, the God-bearer. So again, the Blessed Virgin here as the Queen of Christendom, because she's the Mother of God. And 5th century also St. Leo the Great, reigning from 440 to 461, this great Pope. And then to conclude our discussion of the good, St. Patrick. St. Patrick needs no introduction, but I'm an Englishman. And of course, we could claim that St. Patrick was an Englishman. He was. I'm going to get stoned. I like it dangerously. Most people think that he was probably born in what is now the Lake District of England, in Cumbria. But of course, this was the England before England, right? The English hadn't arrived, so the Celts don't have to get too offended that even England was Celtic in those days. But he was probably born in what is now England, and was taken as a slave to Ireland, and eventually, of course, became a great evangelist to the Irish. So let's move on now to the bad. And of course, this is the time where the rise of the barbarians. So the ballad about the indigenous barbarians in what is now Mexico. But in the 5th century, it was the Goths, and then the Vandals, and then Attila the Hun. So Christendom was being beset on all sides by this rise of barbarism, and they were thriving on the weakness of the Roman Empire, which was in the process of imploding, largely on the weakness of its own decadence. And I want to quote here from St. Jerome, another great saint from that century, who's living in a sort of hermitage or a grotto in Bethlehem. When he learns of the fall of Rome, the unthinkable, the eternal city. An ancient city has collapsed, he lamented. She who was, for so many centuries, mistress of the world. Later he would say that, quote, the whole world was decapitated when Rome fell. And upon hearing from refugees of the rape, pillage, and massacres, he felt that, quote, the universe had collapsed. And again, one of the big mistakes we make is to think that our own time is the worst of times and the world's coming to an end. It's difficult for us to imagine what people would have thought when the Roman Empire, which seemed so impregnable and so permanent, collapsed in the 5th century. And again, words of St. Augustine might come to mind. No abiding city. This side of the grave in the temple cosmos, there is no abiding city, but there's the city of our own body, where there's any city of the body politic. That time also there was a heresy which was very old and also very new. The old name it goes by is Pelagianism, but it's also probably the most popular and populist of the heresies of today. It's what we would now call the self-help gospel. And if you go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon, for every one book on the shelf that's about Christianity, you'll find 6 or 7 about how you can be perfect just by being narcissistic. The self-help gospel. So Pelagius, the heretic, thought that basically you can get to heaven through the triumph of the will, through the power of your own will. Just listen to what Jesus says in the gospel and do it. What's so difficult? Of course, if that's true, you don't need grace. You don't need supernatural assistance. Just do it yourself. The do-it-yourself religion. If you don't need the sacraments, you don't need grace, you don't need the sacraments. You don't need the sacraments, you don't need the church. So this was a rampant religion, and it was a prevailing religion. So 300 years later, in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England, Pelagius as a heretic and Pelagianism as a heresy is something which is quite clearly something which is still very much preoccupying St. Bede. And when we come to the last part of this chapter, we'll also talk about how it's something which is part of what the Beowulf poet is saying. So again, you would have thought that things are going really badly, right? That politically speaking, the Roman Empire has collapsed. That the permanent has just dissolved. There is no abiding city. There are heresies that are rampant, such as Pelagianism. But we're talking about death and resurrection here, so the end of the 5th century. It is a truism, all too easily uttered, that God writes straight with crooked lines. But the fall of Rome at the hands of barbarians, followed so soon by the conversion of the barbarians to the religion of Rome, must be seen as the bringing of great good from barbaric evil. Might also be seen as one of the many examples of the Church as the mystical body of Christ dying and rising from the dead. So we're going to leave there for the moment the bad, and we're going to talk about the beautiful. And certainly one of the major capitals in the world at the time, really the capital of northern Italy, was Ravenna. If you've been to Ravenna at all, you see the beautiful church and the beautiful mosaics Probably in terms of the visual arts and architecture, that's the height. But I actually want to concentrate, especially as I made some comment from an English perspective about St. Patrick, because one of the great works of beauty from the 5th century is St. Patrick's breastplate. It's a great prayer that we in the Pearce family say every St. Patrick's Day at the dinner table. And I'm going to read just a couple of parts from it. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. And then I want to conclude the reading from this with Christocentric aspects of the prayer. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Prayer is powerful that can conquer the world, conquer the Roman Empire, can conquer Pelagianism. But let's end this reflection of the good, the bad, and the beautiful of the 5th century as we began it with the great St. Augustine. In his Confessions, he praised beauty by praising beauty himself. Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. The 5th century. Moving into the 6th century. And again, if you believe that might is right, it's all about the power of politics, then you don't know your history. Because the barbarians, in their might, conquered the weakness of Rome and the weakness of the Roman Empire, and yet they then were converted to the religion of Rome. There's a parallel in history. We go back to pre-Christian times when Rome conquered Greece and was conquered by Greece. They ended up, the Romans conquered Greece and ended up adopting the Greek gods, basically adopting the Greek pantheon, the Greek myths, the Greek legends, Greek philosophy, the Greek classics. There is no Virgil without Homer. So the conversion of the barbarians was also the conquest of the barbarians by the religion of Rome. And at the time when it seemed that everything was weak, the political power of the empire is in ruins, that the church began to rise from the ashes of empire with the power of humility. Now there's a paradox. Because this is the time of the age of St. Benedict, and also the Irish monks, and Columban and others, evangelizing through radical poverty. And this is what the German historian said, Alfred Larpel, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I'm probably not. The English like to tease the Irish, and they like to mispronounce the German. That's just my excuse for my ignorance. But this is the German historian Alfred Larpel, if you pronounce it that way. This beautiful phrase here. The achievement of the Benedictine monks can be summarized by 3 symbols. The cross, they were messengers of the Christian faith. The book, pioneers and preservers of Western culture. And the plough, promoters of civilization and new settlements. I like, by the way, the juxtaposition of the plough and civilization. And listen to this. Edward Gibbon, author of The History of the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, and no friend of the Catholic Church, stated candidly that, quote, a single Benedictine monastery may have done more for the cause of knowledge than Oxford and Cambridge combined. And that's the judgment of an anti-Catholic. So apart from St. Benedict and Irish monasticism, Benedictine monasticism is also the century. Last century we had St. Leo the Great. This is the century of St. Gregory the Great. And of course we could say a lot about him. Again, being Anglo-centric, forgive me, it was St. Gregory the Great, of course, who sent the great St. Augustine of Canterbury, as he's now known, to England to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxon tribes of England to Catholicism, and that was right at the end of the 6th century, and it continued throughout the 7th century. We'll say more about that later. But the ruler of Italy and the de facto ruler of Rome at the time was Theodoric, the Ostrogoth king of Italy, and he was an Arian. It's the age of Arianism. And he considered it his duty to be defender of the Arian faith, which means, of course, he was persecuting Christians. He was at war with the Eastern Church, at war with Constantinople. And he used Pope John I as what I call a tyrant's tool. This weak Pope was sent to Constantinople to persuade the Emperor of Constantinople to not accept or embrace Arianism, but to tolerate Arianism. And the Pope went in his weakness, and when he arrived in Constantinople, he was treated with a hero's welcome. It's the first time that the person who has the See of Peter had ever gone to Constantinople. He's treated with a hero's welcome, and so Theodoric was outraged when he got back, thought that he basically hadn't done his mission properly, and Pope John I died as a consequence of his persecution. The 6th century also Pope Virgilius, who was not only corrupt but actually had Pope Silverius murdered. Needless to say, Pope Silverius is Saint Silverius, and Virgilius is not Saint Virgilius. In terms of beauty, this was the century in which Hagia Sophia began to be built in Constantinople, this wonderful edifice of architectural beauty. It's also the beginning, or at least the thriving, flourishing of the art of iconography in the East particularly, and of illuminated manuscripts in the West. And as regards the beauty of reason, it's also the century of Boethius' constellation of philosophy, where literary arts, in terms of formal allegory, is brought to the service of philosophy. But for me, because I'm more of a literary person than a philosopher, loving, should we say, beauty. Of course, I know philosophy is beautiful, that's exactly what he's saying. I'm just showing my bias here. But a lesser known work of Boethius is his work De Musica, and I just want to read what I say in the manuscript about this, and about Gregorian chants. I want to finish basically with this 6th century discussing the beauty of music as it was in those days. Apart from his seminal Consolatio, Boethius was the author of a book on music, De Musica, which remained unfinished at the time of his death. Boethius' understanding of music is rooted in Greek philosophy, especially the teaching of Pythagoras and Plato, encapsulated in Plato's dictum, which Boethius cites, that, quote, the soul of the universe was composed according to a musical harmony. This harmony is therefore ultimately divine, to dwelling in the mind of the maker and expressive of the intrinsic goodness, truth and beauty of the Godhead, which pours forth through creation in the musica mundana, the music of the spheres or the world, the inner harmony of the cosmos itself. In this sense, music is united with arithmetic or mathematics, following the rules of order and proportion. Boethius also speaks of the musica humana, the inner harmony of the human person, body and soul, as well as the musica instrumentalis, the physical manifestation of music in an audible sense, what we would now call music. De Musica would become the standard music theory textbook throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, so for centuries, as the Consolatio would become a standard philosophical text. Boethius also happens, beg your pardon. Boethius' enduring influence is made manifest in the words of Lorenzo in The Merchant of Venice, written more than 1,000 years later, in which Lorenzo's words echo Boethius' understanding of the musica mundana, the musica humana, and the musica instrumentalis, alluded to each in the order in which Boethius writes of them. So it's 1,000 years later we see the influence of this one textbook on Shakespeare. How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank. Here will we sit and let the sounds of music creep in our ears, soft stillness and the night become the touches of sweet harmony. Sit, Jessica. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patterns of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls. But whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. Come, ho, and wake Diana with a hymn. With sweetest touches, pierce your mistress's ear and draw her home with music. As for the music instrumentalis, it is indisputably Gregorian chant, which has a place of prominence and preeminence in the history and culture of Christendom. According to the musicologist and music historian Susan Tracy, quote, Gregorian chant is a totally humble art, but also happens to be sublime prayer. There is no other reason for which it was composed than the praise of God. It is also, she argues, the foundation of all Western music. Although it bears his name, it is unlikely that Gregory the Great was responsible for the birth of chant, which probably developed from chants used in the early church and prior to that in the Jewish temple. It is, however, reasonably certain that he did much to encourage its use and popularize it, thereby having his name associated with it so inseparably. Gregorian chant is, of course, also inseparable from the beauty of the liturgy, which it exists to serve. This is a quote from Christopher Dawson. The preservation and development of liturgical tradition was one of the main preoccupations of the Church in the Dark Age that followed the barbarian conquest, since it was in this way that the vitality and continuity of the inner life of Christendom, which was the seed of the new order, was preserved. End quote. Putting the matter more bluntly, John Senior observed that, quote, Christendom, what secularists call Western civilization, is the Mass. Specifically, and returned to Christopher Dawson, it was the Mass celebrated according to, quote, the ancient and conservative Roman tradition, which from the time of St. Gregory the Great came to exercise a far-reaching normative influence on all the Western churches. The 6th century, and we wanted the 7th. In the 7th century, is characterised, one of the major effects of the 7th century was the conversion of England. And I know some of you might be rolling your eyes that there's an Anglo-centric dimension to this lecture, at least I'm confessing it. But if you actually see the 8th century and the important impact that Anglo-Saxon Christians had upon the whole of Christendom through their missionary activity, particularly amongst other things, you will see how important it was that England was converted to Christendom, to Catholicism. So the 7th century, again, is the rise of monasticism. And this is Chesterton. The rush of missionaries from Ireland had all the unexpected onslaught of young men on an old world, and even on a church that showed signs of growing old. Almost, one thing I actually love about America, the United States, even today, is there's a youthfulness and enthusiasm about Americans that sort of, I wrote something once about Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, and the two principal characters in that novel are an old, degenerate, cynical Englishman called Fowler, appropriate name, Fowler, and then a young, idealistic, neoconservative American member of the CIA called Gordon Pyle. And of course they both have it wrong, and they're both actually doing more harm than good. But I said, if you force me to choose between old world cynicism and new world naivete, I would choose new world naivete. But here we have Chesterton talking about the Irish as being the new world. And the Irish go out, relatively newly converted to the faith by St. Patrick. And with this youthful enthusiasm, they go out and they re-evangelize parts of Christendom that had grown old. And then, of course, the renewal of the church by Benedict was, in the words of John Henry Newman, a restoration. This is a quote by Newman. Again, beautiful because it's Newman. Silent men were observed about the country, or discovered in the forest, digging, clearing, and building. And other silent men, not seen, were sitting in the cold cloister, tiring their eyes and keeping their attention on the stretch, while they painfully copied and recopied the manuscripts which they had saved. There was no one who contended or cried out or drew attention to what was going on, but by degrees the woody swamp became a hermitage, a religious house, a farm, an abbey, a village, a seminary, a school of learning, and a city. Taking up Newman's theme of the role of the monasteries in conserving the culture of civilization in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire, and ultimately restoring it so that civilization itself could be resuscitated and resurrected, G.K. Chesterton spoke of the church as the bridge across a barbarian abyss. Quote, Christianity, so far from belonging to the Dark Ages, was the one path across the Dark Ages that was not dark. It was the shining bridge connecting two shining civilizations. When we move on to the bad, and we talked about monasticism here, and I'm sort of tempted to use a paradox about this century, the 7th century. The sun rises in the west and sets in the east, because this is the age, of course, of Islam, the rise of Islam, and throughout the 7th century, the following centres of Christendom, Christian cities fell: Antioch, Syria, Palestine, Persia, Egypt, Alexandria, Carthage. If that wasn't bad enough, there was a Christian civil war between Constantinople and Rome. Emperor Constantinople actually had the Pope arrested and sent into exile, and the Pope dies in exile. Whereas the emperor who did that Such a tyrant, he was eventually murdered in his bath by his chamberlain. So as regards beauty, this is the age of the stela, the sort of stone carvings, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the illuminated manuscripts again, and of course the spread of chant. I'm going to move to the 8th century. Eventually. Actually, let me read this. I meant to read this, I know I didn't. I missed it. Sorry. So we're still in the 7th century. It was ironic that Pope St. Martin I, the last pope to be designated a martyr, should have been killed by the Emperor of Constantinople, who was, ostensibly at least, the secular ruler of Christendom. It was a Christian Caesar who had sentenced to death the successor of Peter. Such treachery was not unusual. It was often the lukewarm cafeteria Christians who put the saints to death, preferring their own worldliness and their own interpretations of the church teaching to the sanctity and orthodoxy of the true disciples of Christ. Such was the fate of a group of Irish missionaries martyred on the coast of Cornwall, that's in the southwest of England, as recounted by G.K. Chesterton. Quote, "The chief authority on Cornish antiquities told me he did not believe for a moment that they were martyred by heathens, but, as he expressed it with some humour, quote, by rather slack Christians." End quote. As often as not, then as now, it is not the infidels who pose the greatest threat to Christendom and the life of the church, but those of little faith. Looks as if I actually want to do something about beauty as well, so let's do that. Yes, it's important. Monasticism should not be passed over lightly. So apart from the stelas and other sacred art engraved in stone, the developing monastic tradition also bore creative fruit in calligraphy and the production of illuminated manuscripts. One of the most celebrated examples of such illumination is the Book of Lindisfarne, which is said to have been made by the monks of Lindisfarne, it's an island off the north-east coast of England, in the late 7th century to St. Cuthbert himself. A further blessed consequence of the spread of the monasteries across Europe was not merely the widespread use of Gregorian chant in the daily lives of the monks, but the cataloguing of the various chants through the development of musical notation. As with their recording of religious texts in illuminated manuscripts, the monks began what could be called the first recording of music through the use of such notation. In a very real sense, the monastic communities were practicing tradition in the Chestertonian sense, in which it is considered to be democracy extended through time, the proxy of the dead and the enfranchisement of the unborn. Quote, "Tradition may be defined as the extension of the franchise. Tradition means giving votes to our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead." End quote. In faithfully copying ancient texts, the monks were custodians of the past who were enriching the future. They were saving a priceless heritage from being lost and cancelled by barbarians, thereby ensuring the transmission of civilized culture to future generations who would otherwise have been condemned to ignorance. Once again, since Chesterton says it best, the last word shall be his. Quote, "The Christian church was the last life of the old society and was also the first life of the new. She took the people who were forgetting how to make an arch, and she taught them to invent the Gothic arch. In a word, the most absurd thing that could be said of the church is the thing we have all heard said of it. How can we say that the church wishes to bring us back into the dark ages? The church was the only thing that ever brought us out of them." Alright, now we move on to the 8th century. In England, the giant in England in the 8th century was St. Bede, who was made a doctor of the church in 1899. But also this was the age of the English missionaries to Europe, and especially to Germany. It was the English Saint Boniface who converted the Germans, and this is what Christopher Dawson has to say about his importance. The work of Saint Boniface did more than any other factor to lay the foundations of medieval Christendom. That's a sweeping statement. His mission to Germany was not an isolated spiritual adventure like the achievements of his Celtic predecessors. It was part of a far-sighted program of construction and reform planned with all the method and statesmanship of the Roman tradition. It involved a triple alliance between the Anglo-Saxon missionaries, the papacy, and the family of Charles Martel, the de facto rulers of the Frankish kingdom. And then the other giant from England at the time, this is really 8th century, is probably the century where the English made the most contribution to Christendom. And Alcuin, talk about Alcuin now in the court of Charlemagne. In 735, the same year in which Bede died, Alcuin, the most influential scholar of the 8th century, was born. He was educated by men whom Bede had taught. This passing of the baton of knowledge from one generation to the next exemplifies the continuum of accumulated wisdom across the ages that rightly bears the name of civilization. Writing of the flowering of knowledge and scholarship in Anglo-Saxon England, Father Alfred Manson illustrates the connection between the revival of the liberal arts and the Church's insistence on the marriage of faith and reason. Quote, "To Alcuin, as to Alfred the Great, study and the pursuit of knowledge was part of the Christian life, and the liberal arts were not practiced as ends in themselves, but as subserving, in one way or another, the great end of enriching the Christian life and advancing in the understanding of revelation." So Alcuin basically established schools across Christendom, and Charlemagne was his own student. So this is quite a great time of learning. Now the bad in the 8th century, Islam, of course, is continuing its invasion and incursions. In 711, it crosses from North Africa, which it had now conquered, into Spain, and would be present in Spain for hundreds of years. Established in 711 when they first arrived in Spain. In 732 they got as far north as Tours in the north of France. If it wasn't for the victory of Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, it's entirely possible the whole of Christendom would have been overrun by Islam. That's an absolutely axiomatic, crucial battle. So you have this battle. Islam is now sort of having invaded across the whole of North Africa, into Spain, up into France, and pushed back out of France. Deo gratias. But in the East, the Muslim influence had influenced Constantinople, because this was the time of iconoclasm, where the emperors of Constantinople want to basically destroy all holy images, doing exactly Islam's dirty work. It was Pope Gregory III who condemned iconoclasm and defended sacred art. Now, in terms of beauty here, I want to say briefly about Beowulf. And most people, most experts on something think Beowulf, the Beowulf poet, who was almost certainly a monk, was a contemporary of Saint Bede. If you look at the story of Beowulf, very briefly, because all the time we have now, how do we do a 2-minute version of Beowulf? It can be done, it can be done. So basically Beowulf, those of you who know it, is divided into 3 parts, right? In the first part, we're told about this warrior who's the most powerful man who's ever lived, can fight anybody, can swim further than anybody, he's indestructible. He's so indestructible, he can defeat this monster Grendel with his bare hands, by the power of his own strength. And he does so. Very impressive. But then Grendel's mother gets a bit annoyed, the second part of the poem. And now, for some reason, Beowulf's going to go not just with his strength, was going to go with the greatest sword that's ever been made, never lost in battle. So now we have the strongest man with his own strength, armed with the best human technology that we can muster to fight Grendel's mother. And his strength is inadequate. The strength of the sword is inadequate. He's going to die. He tells us, I would have died. But there's this miraculous sword appears. Magical, if you prefer. And on its hilt are figures from salvation history. This miraculous sword from heaven, grace, he has the power to destroy evil. He could not do it by himself. No human technology could do it. He needs supernatural assistance. The third part is an allegory on the Passion of Christ, but that's probably beyond the realm of what we're talking about here. But the key thing here is, of course, that Beowulf poet and Bede are both preoccupied with this self-help heresy, Pelagianism. So in the 9th century, let's try to do the last 2 centuries in about 5 or 10 minutes, because I'm keeping things down to a manageable length here. On Christmas Day, 800, Charlemagne is crowned. We have the Holy Roman Empire now. This chapter is called Great Kings and Vikings in my book. And again, once you've got a Holy Roman Empire, that's good and bad. It's good that the secular ruler considers himself to be a Christian and a defender of Christendom, but it also means that the secular ruler thinks he should have some control over Christendom. So there's always this tension. St. Cyril and Methodius at this time very important, because Cyrillic script, which the Russian language and what have you, that was invented by St. Cyril and Methodius to help evangelize the Slavs in Eastern Europe. So the missionary effort in Eastern Europe, the Slavic nations. It's also the century of Alfred the Great. According to Hilaire Belloc, if Alfred the Great had not defeated the Vikings about the Meth Doom, then the whole of Christendom might have fallen. And I don't have time to talk about his rationale for that. And of course, G.K. Chesterton wrote a whole epic ballad, the Ballad of the White Horse, about Alfred the Great's battle against heathenism, the Vikings in the north. Alfred the Great, amongst other things, was a great scholar and translated Boethius' Constellation of Philosophy from Latin into English, amongst other things. In 840, onto the bad, 846, Islam sacks Rome. The infidels actually at the gates of Rome itself. The Vikings, the pagan Vikings, conquer the north of England, and the northern city of York, that was the northern capital of the Roman Empire. In fact, the name York is Jorvik. It's the Viking name for it. And in the capital of Ireland, Dublin, was also a Viking settlement. So you have the pagans now conquering the north, you have Islam conquering in the south. So things are much worse in the 21st century than they've ever been in the past. But this is what Philip Hughes, their church historian, says about the end of the 9th century. By the end of the 9th century, Western Europe presented a scene of indescribable chaos, an immense waste, with only a few islets of security and ordered life scattered about here and there. And for another generation, what was left of Christendom had barely strength to breathe. If you lived at the end of the 9th century, you'd probably be saying, it's all over. So we come to the 10th century. 10th century is another great monastic revival. It's as if God sends grace and sends saints when the church needs them. It's never... Anyway, it's a quote. The monks at Cluny followed the Benedictine rule with a renewed sense of vigour and rigour. Some were devoted to full-time prayer, and all were subject to holy silence, except for the chanting of the divine office. Such was the reverence in which Cluny was held that bishops and secular rulers began to invite Cluny to establish daughter houses in its likeness in many parts of Christendom. Cluniac priories were found in the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, England and Germany. By 1100, there were no fewer than 1,500 Cluniac priories, each of which was under the jurisdiction of the Abbot of Cluny, who was now the most powerful person in the church, with the exception of the Pope himself. I lived for a while in a small village in England called Castleacre. One end of the village was a ruined Norman castle. I lived in a 14th century cottage attached to the medieval arch built from the stones of the Norman castle, when the Norman castle no longer needed. The Norman set up castle all across the country to garrison against an Anglo-Saxon uprising, which didn't happen, so the castle was very quickly abandoned, and then they were pulled apart by the people for building materials, so that the cottage I lived in was built from the castle. But the other end of the village, just beyond the 11th century Norman church, was a Cluniac priory, and it was just the ruins, because Henry had ruined it, but even in its ruins, the majesty of it is just breathtaking. Right to the bad. I think the end of the 9th century was bad. John X, Pope John X, had been murdered for endeavouring to free the papacy from Roman aristocratic dominance and decadence. He was imprisoned and then suffocated in the Castel Sant'Angelo at the behest of the notorious matriarch Marozia. This femme formidable and femme fatale then appointed the next two popes, Leo VI and Stephen VII, before appointing her own son as Pope John XI. Another of Marozia's sons, Alberic II, became the secular ruler of Rome in 932 by deposing his mother and stepfather. Imprisoned by her own son, Marozia languished in prison until her death 5 years later. During his 22-year reign, Alberic would appoint 5 popes to do his bidding. It's a little surprise that this period in the history of the papacy has become known as the Seculum Obscurum, the dark century of the Dark Age. There was a Dark Ages, this was it. A time when, according to papal historian Eamon Duffy, quote, the papacy became the possession of the great Roman families. Yet even in the midst of such anarchic decadence, there were glimmers of goodness. 2 of Alberic's appointments, Leo VII and Agapetus II, were great promoters of the monastic revival before being a friend and supporter of the saintly Abbot Odo of Cluny. So things pretty bad. So it was a time of great architecture. Particularly these Cluniac priories and monasteries were very, very beautiful in their structure. And there's a particular favourite of mine, I did mention, and I want to mention this, it's just beautiful. The Giro, if that's the right pronunciation, crucifix. In around 970, a life-size sculpture of Christ was commissioned by Giro, Archbishop of Cologne. The Giro crucifix, as it is known, can still be seen in Cologne Cathedral. The figure of Christ is 6 foot 2 inches in height and is sculpted in painted and gilded oak. Its most remarkable feature is its graphic realism, so different from the spiritualized approach of iconography. The corpse of Christ leans forward from the cross, bereft of life, the head drooped, the arms stretching and seemingly to strain under the weight. An interesting feature is the small cavity in the back of the head designed to hold a fragment of the Eucharistic host, making the crucifix a tabernacle to host the very Lord that the sculpture represents. And just to conclude, we'll conclude with a page of manuscript dating from the end of the 10th century, which serves to epitomise what was best and worst in this darkest and most monastic and monstrous of centuries. By the way, the chapter in the 10th century I've titled Monasteries and Monstrosities. It is the painting in the Gospels of Otto III showing Christ washing the feet of his disciples. This great act of humility on the part of Christ serves to illustrate that the greatest must be servant of the least. This was the spirit of holy poverty that animated the monastic reform and revival heralded by the founding of Cluny Abbey. The absence of such a spirit was seen in the corrupt and decadent aristocrats and the corrupt and decadent popes that they appointed. It is indeed significant that the same chapter of St. John's Gospel in which Christ washes the feet of his disciples is the chapter in which Christ exposes Judas as the one who will betray him. In the 10th century, as in the 1st, and as in the 21st, Christ knows his sheep as he knows the wolves in sheep's clothing, and even the wolves in shepherd's clothing who betray him. The wicked, like the poor, are always with us, but so are the saints. Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe about 5 minutes for questions. I want to make sure people have time for mulled wine and buy books. Check out the books. The other thing I would say, by the way, when we stop the Q&A in about 5 or so minutes, if you have questions, come through. I'll happily answer them in there. And if there's a saint amongst you, you could bring me a glass of mulled wine up in there. Any questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you could say something generally about the emergence of Christian art, how they went from a people who had a literal understanding about not making idols to having cathedrals filled with statues, just anything general you could say.
Well, yeah, that's a great question, but I'm not sure it's that simple because you've got Aristotle writing about poetics. I think that the connection between reason and beauty goes right back. Right back to Homer, and probably goes back further. We just don't know it. So I think for we are made in the image of God. And when Christ says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," He says, "I am the good, the true, and the beautiful." And we are also, in some sense, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I think that any of us, I'm talking about all of us, as in terms going right back, as far back as we can go, will see the connection between goodness, truth, and beauty, between love, virtue, reason, and beauty. And I think that's part of who and what we are. That's why Chesterton in The Everlasting Man, the first chapter in it is the man in the cave. When he says, what do we do if we go in the cave? Do we find barbarism? No, we find an artist. So I think it's as old as we are. The desire for beauty and the connection between beauty and reason is as old as we are. So I don't think it sort of just begins with Christendom. I think that it's baptized by Christendom. Reason is baptized by Christendom. Beauty is baptized by Christendom. Love is baptized by Christendom in Christ. But it's not that these things did not exist prior to Christ, because the cosmos that existed prior to Christ was created by Christ.
Thank you.
Just to kind of add to that, what does the Incarnation itself do in terms of kind of showing us that the sensible and the physical in the art is no longer idolatry, but it seems like the Incarnation itself does something, the act of God in becoming man.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to answer that in a moment, but I want to get something clear here that when in C.S. Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress, I think I may have mentioned this earlier, I'm going to say it again because I think it warrants it. Father History says that when the whole of humanity except for the Jews, right, when everybody except the landlord's people, use the phraseology of the work, the landlord is God, landlord's people are the Jews. The landlord's people could read. They understood the law. Nobody else could read. So what does God do to those that can't read? Does he desert them? Does he condemn them? No, he sends them pictures. In other words, that the works of Homer are not idolatrous. The Jews, theologically of course, you can't depict God, right? But I presume they weren't saying you can't draw a picture of your mother. At least I hope so. Otherwise, they're Puritans, right? So the whole understanding, you can't worship false idols. You can't sort of have these gods that you make statues of or paint pictures of. That's idolatry. That's not the true God. And the true God you can't make a picture of, because he is something metaphysical and something which is not incarnate, something who is not incarnate. Then God decides to manifest himself to us in physical form, to show us himself in a way where he meets us. So he's not someone distant and abstract, but someone concrete and real. And of course that revolutionizes everything. Revolutionizes reason, revolutionizes love, it revolutionizes beauty. So yeah, it's absolutely. So in other words, I agree with you, but I do think we need to sort of think that you know, if you're going to start, and you weren't doing this, I'm sure, but suggesting that all art was idolatrous prior to Christ, I don't believe that. Yeah.
Was there a sense between the Western church and the Eastern church? Was there communication during these dark ages, and was once the Eastern churches in communication and supporting, or vice versa? Or was the strain that led up to the schism starting to form already in late Middle Ages?
Well, I mean, there's I'd say love-hate. There's certainly a tense relationship between Constantinople and Rome. And sometimes Constantinople has the higher ground morally. So, you know, for instance, when Theodoric is an Arian and he's king of Italy, and he's using the Pope as a tool to pursue Arianism, and the Emperor of Constantinople is the Orthodox Christian. You know, but obviously, then later on, we saw iconoclasm is being promoted from Constantinople and condemned by the Pope. So there's, you know, when you have worldly power, you're going to have corruption. And that's why, you know, ultimately it's saints, right? It's the monks, it's the holy people that actually build Christendom. There are holy popes, but the holy popes are holy first, the Pope said. You know, and I think that's the key thing. Anybody else? Okay, if you have any other questions, I shall be through there. Do enjoy the mulled wine and Mexican
Treats.
Mexican treats of various types. Yes. Thanks so much, everybody. God bless you now. Merry Christmas.